After 7 years of waiting, The Last of Us Part 2, the sequel to one of the most praised games out there, finally arrived. And the general response was disappointing, to say the least. As it tends to happen when there's an installment of any franchise that decides to take a brave turn, reviews from fans and critics differed a lot. The game opens with Joel, the main character of the first installment, and a fan favorite, being killed in a brutal and helpless way by a woman we don't know. For 10 hours the game lets you believe that you're in a revenge quest, only to change the perspective in the second half, forcing you, literally forcing you, to play as a character you have thought of all along as the villain. Yes, it is a quite controversial choice, yet not necessarily a bad one. It is trying to make you question what you have thought in order to comment on the importance of perspective. It erases the line between what you think is good or even just because those concepts are relative. However, even though the initial audience score has gone up since the game's release, most people agree that the game does not deserve its almost perfect critic score. It is hard to talk about The Last of Us Part 2, because even if there seems to be a seeming majority on the internet who thinks the same way, most of the criticism is based on subjective conceptions, which is not at all wrong in any way considering that a 20-hour game is, at least to me, a big commitment which requires a lot of engagement. I'm still struggling to discern which parts of the game I dislike or like because of the game itself, or because of me. So, welcome to this edition of me trying to figure out what the hell is going on with The Last of Us Part 2. One of the things I found very interesting is that Neil Druckmann had an idea, and every single aspect of the game is carefully arranged to express it. The death of Joel in the game is what Robert McKee calls the inciting incident. The first major event of the telling is the primary cause of all that follows, putting into motion the other 4 elements: progressive complications, crisis, climax, and resolution. The importance of having an inciting incident is to get the protagonist, Ellie, to react and go in search of what McKee calls the object of desire. Something that the character feels will restore the balance in her life. For Ellie, this object of desire is revenge. And so, we spend the next 10 hours looking for Abby and killing everything and everyone that crosses our way. However, Robert McKee also argues that the protagonist is going to have an unconscious desire. We get a glimpse of that through the flashbacks. All of them have a common theme: the progression of Ellie's and Joel's relationship. We start with the scene in the museum, then we see how Ellie discovers the truth about what Joel did, and at the end we see her telling him that she would like to forgive him. That's Ellie's unconscious desire, forgiveness. She wants the closure she didn't get with Joel. She thinks that she will get it by avenging him, but the game tells us that what she needs is forgiveness. The concept of revenge is based on the idea of justice. Take for instance the Count of Monte Cristo, because it's no coincidence that it is explicitly mentioned in the game. Edmond Dantes is set up to get his revenge after being incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. That's unfair. So, you could say his actions are justified. Take for instance John Wick. Theon Greyjoy killed his dog. What did the dog do? Nothing. He was an innocent creature, so whatever happens later is to balance the scales, right? Yet, what The Last of Us Part 2 is trying to say is that the concept of justice is relative. We are all the heroes of our own stories. Villains are the heroes of their own stories. That's why, at the end, Ellie learns that revenge is not worth it. What gave Ellie closure was not revenge but forgiveness. Because what is actually and objectively just? Another great element of the game is how the playability is also directly involved in perpetuating this message. And I'm talking here in direct comparison to the other Naughty Dog big franchise I'm acquainted with, Uncharted. Now, playability-wise speaking, in Uncharted you can get a trophy for killing 1,000 people with a shot to the head. But, narrative-wise, at the end of every game, Nate kills the main antagonist in an indirect way, because we are supposed to believe he is the good guy. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Uncharted. Uncharted 4 is one of my favorite games, but that's just funny. In The Last of Us Part 2, the studio achieves something that feels like a whole other level of gameplay. Having the enemies beg for their lives, listening to their casual conversations, hearing their allies yell their names when you kill them. It really does give a further understanding on how Ellie is slowly losing her humanity with every kill. She is killing people, not only masked and unnamed stormtroopers. The theme of perspective is fully developed in the second half of the game, which picks up again in the scene of Joel's death, showing us the other side of the coin. This moment is also an inciting incident in Abby's storyline only because they let Ellie leave. We get to know Abby's friends, especially Mel and Owen. Through flashbacks, we see how Abby's pursuit for revenge drove her away from the man she loved. We see that in the eyes of Abby and her friends, they did the right thing by killing Joel. They made justice. If you take into account all these fantastic decisions, it is easy to understand why the game is getting so much praise from critics. There is one issue in The Last of Us Part 2 that I actually consider a flaw of the game itself, and that is Abby's character arc. As I mentioned before, the whole point of Ellie's storyline is to get to her unconscious desire, to find closure in forgiveness. But what does Abby learn in the 10 hours we spend with her? What does she want? What does she need? I could say she learns that not everything is black and white because of her relationship with Lev and Yara. But I do not see that because in the end she massacres both wolves and seraphites. So, she just met a kid she cared for. In the end, she became Joel, killing everyone in her way to protect him. Did she learn after watching her friends die that revenge was not worth losing them? Well, no, because when we see her fighting against Ellie, she is willing to kill Dina, specifically after being told she is pregnant. For her, it's even better, because that would balance the scales after Ellie killed Mel. So in that case, this whole revenge is not worth it idea is completely abandoned. Yes, she lets Dina live, but because of Lev. Had he not been there, she would have done it, which means she has not grown at all, not learned anything. Hell, even if they decided to go very dark, she could have learned to not let loose ends. But she lets Ellie live again. At the end, we see her in a terrible state that has nothing to do with Ellie, or revenge, or anything related to the theme of the game. She just got captured by a band of terrible people introduced 2 hours before the end of the game, just to have a final confrontation where you get to use the ammunition you have left. So, the whole second part only accomplishes that we get to know Abby and Lev. That said, it humanizes her. It makes us understand her reasons and her motivations. But that's just it. She doesn't change. It's as if it was just an introduction. Which, in my opinion, it would only make sense if we get to see her in a sequel. Now, as I said, I have many problems with The Last of Us Part 2. And, except for the one I just mentioned, I feel the rest are completely because of my own personal experience with the game. For example, the fact that I do not give a fuck about Abby. After her introduction, the fact is that I had made up my mind about her. I was there for the vengeance. But that is certainly not the case for everyone, so I do not consider that a flaw that affects the game's overall quality. Normally, I would argue that characters don't need to be likable. My favorite book is The Great Gatsby and most of the characters are jerks. But video games are a very different medium to literature or cinema. To begin with, a 2-hour movie is not that big of a commitment as it is a 20-hour game. In literature, you can spend 20 hours reading a novel, but you are not directly involved in the character's actions. Video games, on the other hand, depend on the player being involved. As scholar Espen Arseth puts it, since a game is a process rather than an object, there can be no game without players playing. In a game like The Last of Us, where the playability and the narrative are so closely tied up, where the narrative offers the context for the player to experience the game, a character's likability is very important. When talking about the likability of characters, Stephen Koch argues that what is sympathetic may not be likable, what is likable may not be admirable. For example, the game keeps telling us that Joel is a bad person who hurt just too many people, yet, being the main character of the first The Last of Us and having seen his best side as Ellie's father figure, we like him. That's why people looked forward to playing with him in the sequel. Abby, on the contrary, whereas you can understand her, it is hard to actually like her, and it affects the way you act in the gameplay. Take for instance the part where you fight Ellie as Abby. I had no investment whatsoever in that part. I just kept letting the character die over and over until I got bored and was forced to continue. Engagement is a highly important element in video games in a way it is not for books or movies. According to Souvik Mukherjee, I'm sure I blew that pronunciation, gameplay is about the interaction of the game and player. And to me, that interaction felt like a pain in the ass.